We'll admit all, and we'll go live. Ready?
Ready?
Awesome.
Don't even hold. We're just gonna leave the party out.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a Solidarity Economy Working Group webinar featuring our fantabulous guest, Julie Matthaei and Emily Kawano. I'll be your co-host this evening. My name is Brandon Peyton Carrillo, and my partner in crime. Your name?
Good evening. My name is Mike Strode with the Coldernut Collaborative in Chicago, as well as a board member with the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, Education with New Economy Coalition, Educators Working Group, and a few other things.
Awesome. So we have a lot of you folks on today. Man, this is super cool. So I think we should get started. So first up, to discuss their perspective and their wonderful article that's been put out through various channels throughout the country. Julie Matthaei, I would like to give you the floor. Tell everybody who you are before we get into the meat of things.
Okay, this is the very first meeting I've started on time. This is exciting. I'm Julie Matthaei. I was a professor at Wellesley many years. They're one radical in economics department. And I'm helped co-found the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, which pretty much brought the concept of the solidarity economy to the U.S., or we were one of the groups that did in 2007 at the U.S. Social Forum. And I've co-edited a book on that, and I'm working on a book now on the solidarity economy, and I've written articles. And I'm a feminist, anti-racist, ecological economist, Marxist. And I pass it to Emily.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I'm Emily Kawano. I am an economist by training, but I've been in the real world for most of my time. My day job is I'm the co-director of Wellspring Cooperative in Springfield, Mass. We're developing a network of worker-owned businesses in Springfield's underserved communities. But I've been involved with Solidarity Economy for a long time. One of the co-founders of Solidarity Economy Network. I also served on the board of RIPES, which is the intercontinental network of Solidarity Economy, for almost 10 years. Yeah, and I'm so happy to be here.
Me too. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you talking about this important topic.
Awesome. Before we get jumping into the meat of our discussion, I just want to state a few of the rules of what we're doing. So we're going to have a presentation. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. It'd be nice for folks if they want to introduce themselves, like, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm with this organization, and I love whatever your favorite aspect of the solidarity economy. Or if you don't know what the solidarity economy is, I'm just here to learn new stuff. Just put that in the chat, and then later we'll use the chat to dictate and kind of manage our Q&A portion. Sounds good? All right. Julie?
Okay, I'm passing it to Emily.
Okay, I am going to try sharing my screen. Hopefully this, of course it's not. Oh wait, let me try this. All right. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right, so our talk is entitled System Change, Capitalism, Socialism, and Solidarity Economy. So we want to recognize that this is really a historic moment, you know, a once in a generation or maybe even more rare opportunity to push for real system change. There are converging crises, and I've picked out 4. There probably are more that we could talk about. But COVID, the racial justice uprisings, and climate change, and this slide towards fascism. What history shows us is that crises often create enough fractures in the status quo that you can make real changes, real transformations in systems and in paradigms. So that's the moment we're in, and it's really important that we try to take advantage of this you know, once in a lifetime moment. If we're looking for system change, we have to be kind of clear about what kind of system change are we talking about. And so we're hoping that we can shed some light on that and really talk about the dominant economic system that we live in, which is capitalism, and then look forward to hopefully building a post-capitalist system. So let's start with this table. If you look at the top tier, there's a divide between a capitalist system and a post-capitalist system. I'm going to talk about the capitalist system. Julie's going to talk about the post-capitalist system. So you'll see that under the heading of capitalist or capitalism, there are 3 models, right? There's neoliberalism, there's New Deal capitalism, and social democracy. So we're going to make the case that all of these are different models of capitalism. So before getting into a discussion about each of these 3 models or paradigms of capitalism, I want to first define capitalism. Lots of people, I've heard lots of people say, oh, capitalism is just too hard to define. It's too confusing, and they throw up their hands, and then capitalism just becomes, on the left, capitalism just becomes whatever we don't like. And I think it's dangerous to have such muddle about what is capitalism. So I've been for decades, 30 some years, I've been a member of the Center for Popular Economics, which is a collective of economists working to help demystify the economy. And for 40 years, we've been using the following definition of capitalism. So there are 5 characteristics. The first one is the private ownership of the MOPs. So those are the means of production. So land, factories, tools, equipment, right? Private ownership of the MOPs. That's the capitalist. And then wage labor. There are people, they don't own the means of production. They don't control, they don't have decision-making power. They're hired on, they're paid a wage. That's wage labor. And right there, between that private ownership, in other words, the capitalists, and you have the workers, there you have class struggle, okay, right there. That's particular to the capitalist mode of production. The third feature is profit maximization, a drive for profit maximization. The fourth is commodity production, meaning that it's production for sale, not for use. And so you're producing stuff that's going to maximize your profit. And the fifth one is market exchange. That's the distribution and allocation, okay? The one other important thing to recognize is that one of these characteristics alone does not make it a capitalist mode of production, does not make it a capitalist enterprise. So I've heard some people in a worker cooperative say, oh, well, we're capitalists because We engage in market exchange. We do commodity production. Yeah. The reason why they're not is because there is not a separation between the private ownership and the wage labor, right? There is not that class divide. The workers are the owners, okay? So you need all of these all work together to define the capitalist system. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about each of these three models of capitalism or paradigms of capitalism quickly. So neoliberalism emerged out of, and here I'm going to circle back to the convergence of these different crises that we're seeing right now and why it creates an opportunity. So historically, neoliberalism emerged out of the crisis in the late 70s of stagflation. So stagflation means that you have at the same time stagnation, in other words, recession, and inflation. So stagnation and inflation at the same time. Whereas historically, those two play off of each other in opposite directions. In the late 70s, we had both rising together. Created this crisis. It ushered in the overthrow of New Deal capitalism and the ascendancy of neoliberalism. If neoliberalism had like an Animal Farm slogan, it would be markets good, state bad. So it's all about, you know, the government is the problem, right? That analysis. You might recall the arch conservative Grover Norquist said he'd like to make government small enough to drown in a bathtub. So the goals of a neoliberal perspective is, yes, to delegitimize the government. The government is the problem. Cut back social welfare programs, institute pro-corporate regulations, which often looks like deregulation, right? For air, for environment, for labor standards, for health and safety. So deregulation, and at the same time, various kinds of regulations that are pro-corporate, big corporations. It's a move towards privatization. It's tax breaks for the 1%. The one thing that is just fine in this conservative neoliberal order is, of course, it's always fine to spend money on militarization, whether it's domestic or international or foreign adventurism. So the one qualification I want to make about neoliberalism, it's all of this, right? It's small government, it's deregulation, it's free market, except when it doesn't suit the capitalist interests. So there's many examples of where neoliberals will argue for exactly the opposite. One example is, you know, the argument is for free trade, except when, say, the steel industry in the US was in trouble and then they enacted tariffs and trade protection. So there's a huge amount of hypocrisy here. All right, I'm going to move on to New Deal capitalism. So New Deal capitalism emerged out of another crisis. It was a crisis of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression broke the back of the previous model, which was much like neoliberalism, which was the economy will create its own equilibrium, right? But what happened is with the Great Depression, the economy was not creating its own equilibrium. It was just getting mired deeper and deeper in a depression. And so it broke the back of the previous model and ushered in New Deal capitalism, sometimes called also Keynesianism, after John Maynard Keynes. And it legitimized the role of the government to stabilize the economy, to stimulate the economy, to pull us out of the Great Depression. It legitimized social wealth, the need for social welfare programs. It legitimized the need for regulations for corporations and for the financial interests. and created antitrust laws. It legitimized the role of public entities and enterprises. And then one thing that was the same as under neoliberalism, spending on the military was A-OK. And in fact, what really finally pulled us out of the Great Depression was massive spending during World War II. So that's New Deal capitalism. Social democracy, you can think Scandinavia. So you could think of social democracy as sort of New Deal capitalism on steroids in a good kind of way, right? So much more generous social welfare programs, more control, more regulations on corporations, more equitable taxes, progressive taxation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But some would disagree. In our analysis, social democracy is still capitalism because capitalist corporations still dominate the economy. I'm not going to go into much more detail about that. I do want to mention one more thing, which is about Bernie's platform. So democratic socialism, his public platform of democratic socialism was really, if you think about it, it's really social democracy, right? He rarely talked about challenging ownership and control over the means of production, right? It was expand the government role in this, that, and the other, strengthen social welfare, all good stuff. But if you aren't challenging, if you think back to that, this one, if you're not challenging that mode of production where the capitalist owns and the workers work, right? Without that pretty central change in that relationship, in that class relationship, you're still having capitalism. I'm gonna stop there and turn it over to Julie.
Okay. So let's see.
Let me stop my screen. Wait, hold on. Let me do that. Okay.
There we go. Okay. So we've had an introduction to the different forms of capitalism, different subsystems of capitalism. And now I want to talk about the post-capitalist systems from a solidarity economy perspective. So the first thing I'm going to try to do is just go back to our table and just say here, the way we look at it, we have capitalist system, neoliberalism, which Emily talked to you about, like drown the state in a bathtub, free markets. We've got the New Deal, which was Roosevelt, which Bernie's harking back to often, like a second New Deal, economic human rights, and then social democracy, as in the Scandinavian countries, and social democrats in this country. And then for post-capitalist here, we have some of them are the solidarity economy, and some we see authoritarian state socialism, those early forms of socialism that were experimented with as not being solidarity economy, but still post-capitalist visions. And then I'll look at these other, the whole solidarity economy concept and framework and how it really embraces a whole variety of democratic forms of post-capitalist economics. So let's see. So first I wanted to say that a post-capitalist economics and politics, a post-capitalist framework, it says that capitalism is inherently oppressive. So that's why we call it post-capitalist. Like we think capitalism can be reformed, but our goal is post-capitalism. We think capitalism per se as a system is limited and problematic in terms of its ability to achieve justice and liberation. So reforming capitalism is not alone going to change the essential qualities of capitalism. And post-capitalist systems the goal is to build upon capitalism's achievements and transforming and transcending its limits, which are many, but there are also many achievements, so we have to keep that in mind. Early post-capitalist experiments, like the Soviet Union and China, to be the large countries, and also Cuba, they were inspired by the writings of Karl Marx. And Marx centered his critique of capitalism on class oppression and markets. So if you look at, let me just go back to this slide that we had here. If you look at, hold on, the 5 qualities of capitalism, private ownership of the means of production, that was oppressive because the workers didn't own what they worked, the means of production were not owned by the people who use them. Wage labor is oppressive because you're being bossed around by the owner and you're selling your labor, you're alienating your labor. Profit maximization was a problem with only looking at profits rather than the well-being of people and the health of nature. Commodity production, Marx thought that money itself was problematic, that we had to keep money, and the development of a monetary economy was associated with capitalism. So Marx thought that producing for the market and market exchange, the whole market economy itself was problematic. So rejecting all of those aspects, Marx created a very vague model of socialism, which then socialists around the world and countries actually tried to adopt. So let me talk a little bit about that. So first of all, just to know, and you probably heard this about Marx, this is Marx like in 5 seconds, but he believed that contradictions inside of capitalism were going to bring socialism. And the contradiction that he focused on was the increased immiseration of the working class. More and more people being pushed into the working class, peasants losing their land, going into the working class, small producers losing their businesses and working in the working class, and then the working class getting bigger and bigger and swelled and wages going down, and then people getting together and organizing and creating a revolutionary transformation to post-capitalism. So his vision of socialism was eliminating the capitalist class who owned the means of production and bossed the workers around, and replacing private property and markets with planning. So all the property being nationalized so that people own it together through the state, and getting rid of markets and using planning instead. So the early countries that ended up using this model were actually feudal countries. They hadn't experienced much capitalism. They were run by landlords and czars. For example, the Soviet Union was run by czars. But when they made this revolution, they followed the model of getting rid of markets, nationalizing private property, and creating a classless society. And the markets were replaced by the central planning, and the communist parties of those states were the ones in control of the planning and of the wealth. So we call this kind of economy authoritarian state socialism. There were very different experiences in different countries, but we're just summarizing briefly. Some of the positives were that the ruling classes, which in China and the Soviet Union, for example, were extremely oppressive. The peasants were very downtrodden, very, very few resources, no rights. They were overthrown. So they overthrew the ruling classes. And also the peasants and workers gained a lot of economic human rights, basic economic human rights, like the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to housing, the right to a job or access to land. Now, it's true that the quality of those things was not always good. These were poor countries when they had their revolutions, and the economies did better or worse depending. So the Soviet Union actually became a superpower, so it did accumulate, but the people didn't see a lot of that wealth. But there were these economic human rights. And the second thing that I want to look at is what were some of the negatives. One of the big ones was the Communist Party was really in control, and they were not democratic. They were very authoritarian, and they did not allow, in most cases that I know, and of course there's the spectrum, but civil liberties were not recognized. So disagreeing with the Communist Party was not allowed. Workplaces were not democratized. There was movement in the beginning in the Soviet Union to democratize them, but that ended up not really continuing under Stalin, and pretty much workplace democracy was not something that happened, which would have been something Marx would have definitely advocated for. And also, these authoritarian state socialist countries reproduced patriarchal and racial ethnic inequalities. They didn't target those. And they also were extremely exploitative of nature. So you had environmental disasters like Chernobyl happening in the Soviet Union. China, well, China's not really socialist now, but it's semi-socialist, and it has the worst, some of the worst environmental conditions in the world. Okay, so that's authoritarian state socialism in a nutshell. That's what the solidarity economy is not advocating, and that's what a lot of people, when you say socialism or talk about post-capitalism, everyone puts you in that bucket, and then talk about you're going to take away their civil liberties, you're going to, any dissidents are going to be sent to Siberia. And so we think it is important to distinguish ourselves, at the same time noticing that there were certain achievements of those countries that are valuable and we can learn from. Okay, so what about the democratic post-capitalist systems and the solidarity economy? So I want to start with just introducing the solidarity economy to you. It was such a wonderful, exciting thing for me when I found out about it. It's a framework that emerged in Latin America and Europe about the same time in the 1990s, just about the time the Soviet Union was disintegrating, and it was being argued that that was the end of any socialist experiment. If the Soviet Union was going to fall apart, that was it. No alternative to capitalism, the end of history, like Francis Fukuyama wrote. Leftists started realizing, leftists and progressives started realizing that post-capitalist economic practices and institutions were already existing and emerging all over the world. So instead of like, okay, we have to have a revolution and imagine something in the future, they started looking around them and saying, wow, there's all these post-capitalist institutions already existing and emerging. And the framework they developed, the solidarity economy framework, recognizes these non-capitalist economic practices and institutions, and it sees them as forming the foundation for a new post-capitalist economy. And so it was a huge shift. It's like all of a sudden discovering, and Gibson Graham, J.K. Gibson Graham, also of the community economies movement, also made this kind of discovery in their work, and said the end of capitalism as we know it, and the end of capitalism as we know it was, there's all this other stuff happening that we've been ignoring because we're focusing on capitalism and thinking it's the only thing that exists. So the solidarity economy framework rejects the state-dominated authoritarian forms of socialism, and instead it affirms a core commitment to participatory democracy, both in the political arena and within workplaces. And the other difference, the other huge difference, well, there's a couple of them. Another huge difference is it doesn't necessarily reject markets. So these institutions exist, some of them within markets, selling to markets, buying from markets, and markets themselves are not necessarily oppressive. And then the other thing the solidarity economy framework does is a huge step. It reflects the powerful social movements that have developed in the last 70 years in the US and all over the world. So the feminist movement, the anti-racist movement, the ecology movement, the LGBTQIA movement, the disability movement. I mean, all these movements really are relatively new. And at the beginning when they were happening, a lot of Marxists were saying, this has nothing to do with socialism. This is distracting the working class. But what's happening is that, as we'll see, that those movements are creating the foundation for a new view of post-capitalism that is against all oppression, not just class oppression. So I want to look now at 4 interconnected aspects of the solidarity economy. Let's see if I can get that one up. I think it's this one. Not this one, this one. Okay, so it's kind of complicated what the solidarity economy is, because on the one hand, it's a movement. It's a lot of people, like Emily and I are part of that movement. Many people around the world are part of this movement, either consciously or they're all part of it, but they're not necessarily aware that they're part of building this new economy. But the movement is people who are building the solidarity economy and advocating for it. And they're aware, as they're doing these alternative economic things, they're part of a larger process. So that's the movement. And then the values of the solidarity economy are key, because it's the values that are like the instructions, like the goals. Okay, what do we want our new institutions to do? What do we value? The capitalist institutions, they valued profit for the owners. That was the main value, literally. Anything else was like, nah, I'm not going to care about that unless it increases our profits. So the needs and interests of only the wealthy and the rich and the owners of the capitalist means of production were cared about. Solidarity economy values intersectional, i.e. multidimensional, not just like one dimension of inequality, an intersectional view. Post-capitalist values created and refined by the movement of movements. And I like this concept of the movement of movements. It comes out of the social forum movement, which is a wonderful movement that's been around for about 20 years, and whose motto is another world is possible. And the movement of movements, the social forum movement, brought together feminists, anti-racist, ecologists, peace movement people, indigenous rights people, disability rights people, you name it, climate change activists. They brought them all together to try to build another world. And that's why it's a movement of movements. So one movement isn't enough to create solidarity economy values. So Marx's view was class. That was one movement. That was a big movement, workers, but it was only looking one-dimensionally at the issue. So solidarity economy values come from the movement of movements, from all these different movements against oppression and injustice. So the practices are another part of the solidarity economy, pre and post-capitalist economic practices and institutions that express and align with the values. And they can be totally varied. One country can create this kind, one locality, this kind. The framework of the solidarity economy is not like one size fits all, and we'll look at that later. It's a huge part of it, that the institutions vary. It's not, that's why the solidarity economy, if you look at it at the last one, the framework is a framework that visualizes and connects solidarity economy values and practices. So it looks at the value, connects them, we're always evolving these values, we're evolving all these practices and institutions, and we're realizing they're connected. They're part of creating a new system. You can't create a new system overnight. People have to relate differently. They have to have different values. They have different concepts of themselves, different ways of relating than all these different institutions. So it's a process. So the values and practices are being experimented with around the world in movements and these institutions. We have connection across countries. We have conferences. We highlight the best practices. So the framework is a very, very important. So you can see they're all interconnected, but in a way distinct. So it's important to show that. And it's different from just a regular like utopian socialist model, like, oh, this is our model of post-capitalism. You do this. It's not that. It's more than that. It's a movement. It's values that bring the practices, and it's a framework that not only connects these practices, but also obviously when you think about it, it's a strategy. It's saying we can be growing these alternative values and practices right here alongside of capitalism, and even within capitalist institutions. And not only we can, it's saying we are doing that now. So look around and see all the things we're doing. So speaking of that, I think I'm going to skip a point here that I was going to make. Oh yes, no, I'm not going to skip it. It's really fun. So the next thing I'm going to do is something I've never done. I'm going to do this Mentimeter, because core to the solidarity economy is these values. They're like the precious thing. Values are how we define ourselves, how we construct ourselves, what our goals are, how we relate to each other. And you're talking about racist, patriarchal, classist, environmentally destructive capitalism. Those are the values that are embedded in capitalism from the beginning. And we're talking about changing those. So how do we do that? So the first thing is to point out those values are already evolving. They're already there. We have them already. So what I want to do is see if I can get you to this Mentimeter. which is somewhere here. Oh, why don't I see it? Okay, show all windows. Oh, Emily, what can I do? Let's see, it's not showing. So can I go back? I really want to do this. So everyone take a little break and write a question in the chat.
So everybody anybody who is either on the computer or you can do it on your phone, if you can go to
But I want to be able to
menti.com.
see it. Yeah, oh, here it
No,
is.
they just can go ahead and get on menti.com, and then
Okay,
you
they
need
can
to give
start doing
them.
it. Yeah.
So if you connect to menti.com, and then Julie's going to give you a code. You'll see a little box for code.
Yeah, but it's like, it's open on my
So
thing.
just share a screen. Huh?
Oh, okay, share the screen with that, okay. I am, but I'm not, hold on. I'm going to share the screen. If I go to my, Firefox, I have it.
Is it
But if I go to my,
and that you all have, would you all like me to share my screen? I don't know.
but I can tell you the code, and you can start doing that. And then I'll be trying to find out how to get it to show on the screen. So the code is 80 65 36 0. 80 65 36 0. So you go to Menti, www.menti.com, and the code is 80 65 36 0. And what I want you to do is write a value, 3 values that you think should underlie a post-capitalist economy that we want to build. And meanwhile, I'm going to see if I can find out how to. I'm starting to see them myself. Okay. Try it again. Oh yeah, I see it. Good. I probably shouldn't show it, but you can see, and the bigger ones are the ones people are picking more. Is everyone done? We're a little bit, well, let's start reading them and you can keep adding. Democracy, equity, solidarity, equality, justice, autonomy, self-determination. Wow, these are great. Gender equality, I saw anti-racism somewhere. Ecological restoration, care, economic democracy, anti-sociopathic. You wouldn't think you had to put that as a value, but you really do. Inclusion, cooperative, joy. Oh, this is so beautiful. We need to keep this for sure. I'll see if I can send it with the notes so you guys can see it. So look at these values. So when you say, someone says to you, how could you ever have another economy? And where's it going to come from? Well, just ask them what their values are. Even a lot of conservative people have these values. They just don't think there's a way to achieve them, that they're not going to be, that's not going to be them in a concentration camp. So people have really been trained and programmed to believe there's no alternative to capitalism. So a big job for us all is to open people's minds. Because if you don't believe it can happen, it's going to be hard to make it happen. So going back to my, what I was going to say, the solidarity economy, I'm going to unshare this now, but this is beautiful. And then I'm going to share a different screen. Hopefully this is right. Yes, it's correct. So, oops. So the values that we tend to boil them down to, but it's really a larger list. But you already put them up. Solidarity and cooperation, you listed that. Participatory democracy, both economic and political. People tend to just focus on political, but for radical economists, progressives, workplace democracy is very important. equity in all dimensions. And that, of course, how do you define that? Equality, maybe not just equal rights, maybe equity, fairness, but look at all the dimensions of oppression and keep it. And if there's another dimension of it, we include it. So openness to, and a very aggressive anti-oppression stance. Sustainability, the rights of Mother Earth, diversity and pluralism, that's really important. What that says is there isn't one model. That was very a problem with the socialists that I grew up with in the 60s. They all had their one model. They were all fighting about this model or that model, and very narrow-minded. And this, especially because of the differences in cultures and histories in countries, people have different ways of developing institutions. And many indigenous peoples, they've come to social forum meetings and say, look, our indigenous economies are solidarity economies. Just get rid of capitalism. You know, we're pre-capital, we already had these cooperative and nature-loving and you know, revering ways. One of the ones that we don't tend to put in, but care, it fits here as one kind of way of looking at these values. And from a feminist point of view, it's like valuing the feminine activity of caring and uplifting it. Okay, great. So where am I? So I wanted to point out, let's see, I think the value thing is huge, and the intersectionality, everyone in the movements is talking about intersectionality now. You can't just be feminist, you have to also be anti-racist to liberate women, you have to be anti-classist, you have to look at disability rights. You cannot, feminism was one of the first movements that really learned that big time. And it's spreading so that when you look at progressive movements now, they might focus on gender, they might focus on race, like Black Lives Matter, it focuses on race. But it was started by, you know, queer Black women, and they're very feminist and they're very LGBTQIA and anti-all oppressions. And they really look at class as well. So those are, that's a really big maturing of our movements that is allowing us to create a solidarity economy, because if we were all just based on identity politics, everyone would be split. But once we start creating these common values against all oppression, it allows us to then create institutions that benefit all of us rather than this competitive view of economics that we grew up with. Okay, and in terms of the Big Ten approach, that last point, I just wanted to mention some of the forms. Now, of course, democratic socialism is a form of solidarity economy in our view. So it is against, capitalist ownership of the means of production, looks at transforming the workplace, and is against all other forms of oppression. So it's very much part of the solidarity economy. You might have heard of participatory economics, par-econ. We would definitely include them. In Latin America, they talk a lot about 21st century socialism, which is a Latin form of a solidarity economy. And the solidarity economy movement is very active and powerful in Latin America. In fact, there are graduate courses in the solidarity economy. There are the solidarity economies in the constitution of a lot of the countries. And the notion of buen vivir or sumat causa is a close ally, kind of, again, of solidarity economy framework. Okay. Now, yeah, the other main point that I wanted to make of the general framework is we don't have to wait for the revolution. It's right here now. And I wanted to show you my t-shirt that I'm wearing, show and tell. This is from the Boggs Center in Detroit, Grace Lee Boggs, and they call revolution. So I use a slash instead of the parentheses, but the idea is it's revolution and evolution at the same time. So a lot of time they have this, you know, we're going to evolve gradually to post-capitalism. It kind of sounds like, it doesn't sound like you're going to really get system change. You want to have that revolution word to say systemic change, deep change, a real big change, not just a teeny little change. But it's evolution in the sense that it takes time. It's going to be gradual. It doesn't mean we don't need to be militant. It doesn't mean we don't need to go to the root of things and really change them. But it does mean that we will be revolutionary, and it was going to take time. Okay, so now what I want to do is go on and show you some of the solidarity economy practices that already exist. So here's what the general table, and under solidarity economy, oh, I do want to say, I mentioned par-econ, I mentioned 21st century socialism, I mentioned Democratic Socialists of America and democratic socialism, But then over here, we have other solidarity economy frameworks, one of which is, there's a lot of people, they're just into the solidarity economy. They're in the solidarity economy movement. They don't see themselves as in any of those other groups. They're just active in the solidarity economy. And they don't have any ism, as Emily says. They're part of it. So, okay. So I wanted to look briefly at some of the practices and sectors. So in all sectors of the economy, there are already emerging solidarity economy institutions and practices. In consumption, consumer co-ops, buying clubs, co-op housing, co-housing. I live in a co-housing. Community land trusts, where communities buy land and own it together and then rent it or find ways to sell the use of it, but they keep the ownership of it. It never can be sold. Alternative production, worker co-ops, where workers own the business, so they're not exploited, and they transcend that private ownership of the means of production by capitalists. Producer co-ops, in the sense when producers come together to sell, some of them could be oppressive and capitalist. Volunteer collectives, community gardens, which are popping up everywhere, where the community comes together and claims a piece of land or takes it over and shares it and shares their produce. Collectives of self-employed, unpaid care work. Unpaid care work, to me, it depends on the content. If you're promoting solidarity economy values, solidarity politics, it's definitely part of it. We need to train our children and support each other in having these different values. But you could also have unpaid care work that didn't embody these values, and so I wouldn't necessarily put it in there. Alternative finance, we've got credit unions. Oh, I gotta stop soon, so I wanna move on. Community development credit unions, peer lending, mutuals. You've probably heard of fair trade for exchange. Community currencies, you've heard of those. Time banks are very active and a good thing to do in times like these, or bartering and free cycling. And then over here, governance. We've already, Cambridge, where I live, has participatory budgeting for some of the budget, where people together vote on how to spend money. And that started in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. And collective community management of resources. And basically a lot of government is, in a way, the solidarity economy, because we get together, we make libraries, we have parks, and that's a form of coming together collectively. Okay, so the last question is, why does this matter? If I haven't already convinced you that it's great to have this framework and think post-capitalistically, if that's a verb or an adjective, I just want to quickly go through some of the reasons that I think it's really important. Emily and I think it's important to use this framework. First of all, a lot of people say, don't talk about socialism or post-capitalism, it's too radical. You're going to alienate people, so you should really just talk about reforms. And, well, first of all, especially now with the failures of capitalism, I mean, it is a perfect moment, like Emily said. This is the time to say, hey, everything's burning up. We can't take care of our health, unemployment, climate change, inequality, whatever, corruption, you just name it, everywhere. It's important to look systemically, and we think it's really possible to make the change. So we don't want to sell ourselves short. The reforms are fine. Solidarity economy framework, we support reforms. It's part of that gradual revolution, but the reforms have to be seen as part of a larger transformation. Otherwise, we just get sold out. Women get this little piece of, and then maybe you have a little bit of reforms of the police system, or, you do a little bit for the environment, and, and you play the groups against each other, and nothing really changes. And we've been seeing that for 70 years. So we have to move beyond piecemeal reform, and reforms have to are the most powerful when contextualized as part of a larger systematic change. So the next thing is, this allows you to see all the different connected ways that change needs to happen. We have to change our economic institutions. We have to change the way we view ourselves. We have to change our way of relating to each other. We have to change the values we use in the economy. And what I often said to my students, a lot of these values, we might have them personally, but then we go to the economy, we check our values at the door and we do what the boss said. And what the boss says is maximize the profits of the rich people. Or we have our own business and we're being forced to just look at the bottom line. So how do we bring other values in? Or when we buy things, or we buy from Amazon, or we try to find an alternative. So how do we express our values in our economic life? So that's, when we look at system change, we're able to look at every part because the system is everything. It's not just the economy. I think we should emphasize that in our talk. Okay, and then the final reason that we need to look at system change is, as feminists and anti-racists, we need to realize that we need system change to liberate women and people of color. Again, it's been 50 years since we've had movements, anti-racist and feminist movements, trying to liberate people of color and women within capitalism. And what happens, unfortunately, these struggles tend to get narrowed at the beginning. I know I was in early second wave feminism. There were a lot of revolutionary women in that. A lot of them came out of the left and were mad at the sexist leftist men and were organizing against them. But they started out radical, but they ended up getting narrowed down into looking for equality within capitalism. And those are, or women or Black-owned businesses. You know, you just look at the gender or the race and you don't look at the intersectionality with class. And you know, everyone's not going to become a president, either Barack Obama or Hillary. That doesn't, even if they are president, doesn't liberate women or people of color. There's an intersectionality with class. And also racism and gender are built right into capitalism and the destruction of the ecology. When the firm's goal is profit and maximizing production and throughput, they maximize depleting resources and polluting. So ecology, ecological destruction, the oppression of women and the devaluing of the feminine, and the racist, capitalism was racist from the beginning. It was a white system. It built on colonization of people of color. So those things are all kind of built into capitalism. So we argue that to find true liberation for these groups, we have to look at system change. Now Emily's going to give the final part of our talk.
Okay.
I have it if you can't find it.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead. Just the last slide.
Okay.
Oh, do I have to unshare? No, I don't. Go ahead and share. So this last slide is just thinking about ways forward. This is a little graphic of how we're thinking about the intersecting strategies for transformation. So when we talk about solidarity economy, we really are talking about more than just the economy as the mainstream definition would have it. It's not just about the production of goods and services, because right, the way the economy works involves our culture. It involves how we interact. Right? Are we cooperative? Are we competitive? Are we self-interested? Are we solidaristic? So, and it involves the way the government is run. It involves the way our communities are set up. So when we're talking about solidarity economy, ultimately, we really are talking about economy in the broadest possible sense, which the roots of the word economy means in Greek management of the household. So if you think of management of the community or the regional or the national or the international household, that's really what the economy is. So the way forward, we frame it in terms of resist and build. Some people say fight and build. So resist and build, fight and build. So the build, we think of solidarity economy. We're really building solidarity economy practices. Some are old, some are new, alternative, some are mainstream, some are alternative. But that's sort of the build part, right? Let's start creating our own economic practices. And then under resist, we think of both the grassroots social movements and the community organizing. And we also think under resist all the political, political and electoral strategies and all that work, and trying to shift policy, change policies, etc. So those are both aspects of resistance. It's not real clean, but that's kind of a simplified breakdown of how we think of these different strategies and these different spheres of work. And some organizations are doing all of these, and some are just in one lane. And regardless of whether an organization or group is in one sphere or all the spheres or two of the spheres, the important thing is to try to link it up. The center sphere in the middle is overlapping, right? It's important to the resist and build spheres. So that's thinking about our culture, like a cultural shift, and what we're valuing as a culture. It's not to deny that people are, yes, partly self-interested, they're partly calculating, they're partly rational. So this is all the mainstream economic characterization of who we are as human beings. Homo economicus. It's a real term. It means economic man. This is the assumption, right? This is how human nature is. And we really need to add the other side of human nature, which is our better selves, right? Love, reciprocity, solidarity, altruism, caring, all that good stuff. So culture is important, right? That cultural shift and interpersonal relationships and personal transformation is really fundamental to all three of these spheres. So yeah, we just want to offer that as a way to think about these different areas of work. Not everybody has to be doing all three, but the three spheres need to be working together, right, and supporting each other. Okay, I am going to stop there, and I think we can open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Before we start the discussion, I just would like to throw in, whenever we have somebody who transitions into the next plane of existence, just have a slight moment of silence for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, regardless of how we feel about her politically or whatnot. Let's just take this moment, just a short moment of silence, and then we'll keep the program moving. Okay, thank you for that moment of silence. I know Mike has been collating a couple of the questions that I've been going through. Mike, would you like to kick that off?
Certainly. So yeah, I've been pulling a few of the questions from the chat. So, we'll have some, moments of those before we kind of open up further discussion. But, if you do have any particular response that you might like to render for a question, because, this is sort of collective knowledge. Pardon me, I think the spotlight is still turned on. Yeah, then, just feel free to just drop stack in the chat. We'll try to kind of, move it around that way and just keep some space for collective wisdom to fall into place. So a couple of just housekeeping questions. Where will the recording from this meeting be available after today? I would just say keep an eye on that Facebook event, and we'll post some details both about the recording and the slides there. And yeah, so that might be the best way to go. You can also monitor the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and DSA Solidarity Economy Network Facebook pages. We'll make sure that those things are circulated to all of those mediums. And so yeah, that was also a question about the slides. Big question after that: necro-capitalism, extreme org violence to enable accumulation, surveillance capitalism, enable personal data monetization. are they subtypes of capitalism as well, or are they simply internal tactics within neoliberalism or other economic form? So that wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, so I will pitch that to Julie or Emily if you would like to render any sort of response to that, and I can reread
Yeah.
the question if necessary.
I mean, I don't think it's a system unto itself. I don't think it's a model unto itself. I think that there was pretty brutal, there's been pretty brutal force under all phases of capitalism, even, even the somewhat kinder and gentler New Deal capitalism. And if you think about the history of capitalism and primitive accumulation and how land was seized and genocide was conducted, et cetera, and then continued through colonialism and imperialism, capitalism is pretty brutal. It's not contained to one model or the other.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would agree. I think that it's, and you could think of it though as really, as we're making progress in terms of building new institutions and new values, that it's a big reaction in terms of just creating a lot of violence, a lot of fear, really using naked power to try to maintain the system and the surveillance. So it's really, I think we need to really shine a spotlight on what's happening, shine a spotlight on the injustices, make sure that, try to always counter the arguments that it's, the immigrants are bad, or the people of color are bad, or the radicals are bad. It's really important. I mean, realizing how important civil liberties are to be able to make our case. So I think it's definitely important to talk about these things. And I think even though I agree with Emily that capitalism's had many, many brutal aspects throughout time, including its birth, there is gentler and kinder capitalist forms than others. And those we're, in terms of the revolution moving forward gradually, we definitely prefer the kinder, gentler forms. And we definitely want to work towards, our safety, and totally opposing those kinds of behaviors and institutions, and get the broadest, be in the broadest coalitions we can, I think, to do it. But as we're in those coalitions, that may be thinking in a reformist way, just to get back to the kinder, gentler capitalism, that's where we can raise the issues of system change and talk about, if we really want to be kinder and gentler, capitalism in itself is violent. It does not allow people their basic needs to be met. It allows the concentration of extreme wealth and in the midst of poverty and deprivation. And it's totalitarian in the workplace. And the whole economy is organized around filling the needs of a very small percent of the people. So we need to be making those arguments within these groups. I think it gives us as we strive to protect civil liberties and strive to create safety, and strive to abolish the police and whatever we're striving to.
Okay, and another question after that. Core concern for Indigenous activists is to regain control of stolen lands from the colonial process in Latin America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Africa, etc. Could you describe how Solidarity Economy Framework addresses or could address the return of land to Indigenous groups and sovereignty?
So one thing that is always sort of makes solidarity economy easy is that it's a big tent, right? There isn't one answer, and different people are going to have different answers. And solidarity economy is certainly not saying, oh, this is the way forward or this is the right strategy. And people engaged in those struggles, the general embrace of addressing past wrongs and oppressions is a constant. How you do that, there's a lot of different answers. So I personally wouldn't be comfortable speaking for like, this is my favorite one, or I wouldn't, that's not the movement that is, I have expertise in, so I wouldn't want to speak for those.
I guess I do want to say that so much of the problems that Indigenous peoples are facing now is around resource grabs by large capitalist corporations that are being, supported by their governments that have been corrupted through the corruption of our government and the corruption of political process. So, and a lot of, as I said, in the social reform discussions I've been in, or in meetings I've been in solidarity economy, there are many Indigenous movements that do align themselves. And as I said, you need a post-capitalist framework, whether you're going to go back to traditional Indigenous practices, which, as I said, in many ways embody solidarity economy values. And when you look at taking back your land, I mean, it's like workers taking their means of production. If you're a peasant, you're living off the land, then not owning your land is not having your means of production, not to mention the whole issue of post-colonial, anti-colonial, trying to recapture the land from colonial power. So it's definitely consistent with the solidarity economy values. And what I would say is probably some groups identify more directly than others. But I think in Latin America, there's quite a bit of interconnection, and properly so.
Okay, and I will kick into that old, not the old, but the very current disability justice mantra: nothing about us without us is for us. So, to the extent that we can defer to people who have been, impacted, we can get the right answer. Another question, how would it be possible to learn about and take part in solidarity economy experiments locally?
Do you want to take that, Emily?
Sure.
Local solidarity economy experiments.
Sure, it does depend where you are. Let's see. Well, first of all, if you look, we have a map of the solidarity economy. It isn't complete, but it does give you a sense of how many solidarity economy practices there are all throughout the country, in all different sectors, and it's still very, very incomplete. That link is just solidarityeconomy.us. It's not perfect, but it's pretty amazing. So that's part of it, right? Like everything from how you behave, what your relationship is like, what your own values are, trying to be compassionate, trying to be loving, trying to be solidaritous with other people. I often hear whenever we've had solidarity economy gatherings, people are like, wow, this is just the interpersonal vibe is so great, because people are trying to live the values. So that's one on a personal level. On just in terms of your day-to-day, right? If there is a credit union nearby, a credit union by definition is a kind of a cooperative. I know they're not necessarily looking that different from a regular bank, but at least there is a little bit of accountability that you could hold them to, because they're supposed to be controlled by their members, their depositors. You could, if there's you could try to find practices in your local community to engage in and support. So that's pretty minimal. And then
maybe I'll just kick in on there. I mean, there's many, like time trades. A lot of places do have time trades. There's a lot of community gardens. If you look at that list of institutions, there's probably a lot already that you're connected to. So then you do it, if you do it with the mentality of this is part of me being in a larger, creating a new economy, it creates a whole new feeling to it. Makes you be aware. I remember there was a talk by a Latin American solidarity economy organizer and writer who was saying, to be in a worker co-op is really progressive and wonderful, but it's very different to be in a worker co-op and understand yourself as part of a larger change, be part of a network of co-ops, be part of not just a network of co-ops, but to realize there are all these other economic institutions that you can participate in. So you can start with the little dots, Or you can get involved with larger, like we have a Mass Solidarity Economy Network for people who are in those organizations that come together in that way, for example.
I'd also say that a really easy way to to support the solidarity economy is if you sort of feel comfortable enough with the basic framework of solidarity economy. If you just mention it, even as an individual, test it out, right? But if you are a writer, or if you belong to an organization and you can raise it in your organization as something that's interesting and it's a global movement, or if you have if you're a writer, write about it, right? So just getting the word out about solidarity economy is really, really important. Just that simple thing. It doesn't have to be huge and long, but just mention of, yeah, we see that, you know, that we have alignment with solidarity economy, and people might not understand that, but still it invites a conversation about, well, what is solidarity economy? Yeah. And then there's more involved stuff, as Julie said, like actually getting involved with any of the your local networks or organizations that use a solidarity economy framework, or even if they don't use a solidarity economy framework. Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to be involved.
May I jump in to add a couple? One important factor is an element of the solidarity economy is mutual aid. So right now during the pandemic, there's thousands of mutual aid projects that are going on. There's a lot more literature out there to actually start your own mutual aid project. So if it's something as simple as Food Not Bombs, being involved with them, or if it's, you know, picking up, you know, groceries for elderly people, there are people who are putting together these projects that you can plug into right away. Obviously, you can join a co-op, start a co-op. Myself, I'm a member owner of a brewing co-op. All my money's in a credit union. I'm starting a ISP co-op in Milwaukee. All of these things are ways that you can kind of plug in and get into. So I just wanted to add that up, throw that out there.
Cool.
Okay. Next question. What's to prevent bourgeois powers from privatizing and redefining institutions that operate according to the values of the solidarity economy? One of the largest worker cooperatives in Canada, namely Mountain Equipment Co-op, was recently bought by a U.S. private equity firm. So,
yeah, I'm happy to start. I think it's really, really, really important to bring this big picture analysis and understanding and grounding to any of these actual practices. And it's a piece of work, really. It's a piece of work, and it's all about political education. And so labor unions, cooperatives grew out of the same crucible, and they were radical in their vision. And eventually they split, and they both became much more mainstream and co-opted by the system, and lost that kind of vision that we could, that they were part of a transformative project. And it's hard, right? I think it's just something we have to be really aware of. It's not enough just to create a co-op. It has to be seen, or at least enough of them have to understand themselves as part of this transformative vision. Otherwise, it does become what we have now, which is that all these interesting and wonderful solidarity economy practices are isolated, atomized, and isolated from each other. We don't add up to a hill of beans because we're not seen as joined together as a system. It's just all this cute little co-op here, a cute little CLT, and a cute little local currency there, and it doesn't add up to much. But if we could join, even taking what we have, which is still pretty weak, if we could join it up, we'd have a foundation that's nothing to sneeze at. How do you do that? I mean, so political education is really, 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 really important. Oh, yeah. I will say about co-ops, right? There is a way of of, there is a mechanism, I'm blanking on what it's called, maybe somebody can help me, to prevent demutualization, meaning
Trustee share.
they sell it, what?
A trustee share.
That's not the term, but maybe, so this mechanism is something you would put in your bylaws, which says that if that co-op sells out to whatever, a capitalist buyer, that money does not get split among the workers. It goes to something like the US Federation of Worker Co-ops or something, right? It de-incentivizes workers to sell out their business so that they can pocket the money. There's a term for that, and I can't remember what it is. So sorry. Indivisible reserves. So increasingly, co-ops, worker co-ops, are including indivisible reserve clauses in their bylaws. And I don't know, Mike, how a trustee reserve, is that what you said? I don't know how that would work.
Well, I said a trustee share. So that's usually if you have an entity which is developing cooperatives, and so it wants to prevent cooperatives that it's supporting from demutualizing, it will drop in a trustee share so that it has to approve demutualization on the cooperative, which keeps it part of the ecosystem. So, you know, it's a way to kind of tie it into a larger community initiative. So
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, and I will just kind of offer some feedback just from the perspective of you know, from the perspective of being on the board of a food cooperative, right? You know, and food cooperatives are the sometimes called the capitalists of the solidarity economy, right? You know, just because they can be agents of gentrification, they can be agents of just, you know, other forces, but you know, the way to kind of shift how these things operate is really to play, you know, both highlight the sort of rights and responsibilities that members have in terms of shifting the institutions. So down in Alabama, you know, recently there was a number of different rural electric cooperatives that were, you know, had racist practices in their boards, excluding black members. And, you know, We Own It, you know, has really been a force in terms of highlighting members' rights and responsibilities and helping members to get seats on those boards, and just so that they can uproot, you know, those racist practices and effectively, you know, bring those boards back under the sort of purview of members. And, you know, I don't know if anybody had the opportunity to do that with Mountain Equipment Co-op. As I told someone else, it probably hasn't operated as a cooperative with very democratic practices in a long time, such as like REI, you know, but, you know, hey, building sort of other structures that can hold these cooperatives accountable is probably going to be the way to have leverage to ensure that they function as cooperatives. So another question, how do we protect the changes? Just, I guess there's a comment. My parents lived in one of the oldest co-ops in the country, York Center in Lombard, Illinois, created in the late 40s, which addressed a lot of what you were saying. About 12 years ago, a large developer took them to court to break the co-op up and was successful. They asked for old board notes, which were few and sketchy due to it being a friendly community in different times. It was so sad. So not only, you know, can they be lost just by, I mean, just by lack of attention, you know, members are just like out of the loop, and effectively these things can get dissolved in that way. Let's see, I see the solidarity economy as a movement towards proletarian values. It is a constant battle between the bourgeoisie and proletarian values, between domination and egalitarianism, between brutal competition and cooperation. While I like the movement we're seeing towards proletarian values, SE values, the bourgeoisie ultimately has the final say over the values communicated through mainstream media. So I don't know if anyone has feedback or a comment on that. It's just a commentary.
I think it's totally true. And the media is really programming us. It's owned by a very small group of very wealthy people. And luckily we have alternative media that we can support, and we can use these platforms and stuff, but it's really shocking. And it's shocking to me as an economist. We disproved the theories. Mainstream economics theory was disproved when I was in graduate school in the 70s, and it's still accepted. It's still the dominant view of economics. There's just a small share of radicals. So people are not aware of the level of mind control. I almost think it's important to really point it out, along with the surveillance and the violence, is the mind control, because people think that they think they're thinking, and they think they're getting the free marketplace of ideas. They're not aware of the extent to which that, like you said, the bourgeois view is being propagated and propagated and propagated in the way of the censorship of alternative views. And just knowing that is the beginning, and then people can be a little more careful. Just the way Google, for example, how prejudiced it is in its searches. There have been some studies that have come out on that, and people think, oh, Google is just like neutral. I'll just Google this, Google that, and you're going to get, more of the same, and not even know you're in a cage. So knowing that you're in that mind control cage, I think, is the first step. And then you try to figure out, well, what am I getting, and where do I need to get my information? Because whenever I talk on the solidarity economy, people say to me, why haven't I heard about this before? My students come to the class and they think, I teach them about it, and they think, wow, everyone must know about this. Other economists must know. My colleagues don't know. Other economists don't know. But there's not freedom of thought in the country. And so, like Emily said, any opportunity we can have to talk about there can be change, challenge the status quo, challenge what economists are saying, challenge what scientists are saying, challenge, and put in the possibility of this transformation and seed that in people and help them think critically, because it's really a problem. People are very much oppressed through our minds.
Okay. And there was, then next question was, system change will get pushback, often violent, from global oligarchs. How can the solidarity movement respond? So community defense as a potential theme here.
Yeah. That's a tough one. I think we would say, as they, we're not going to put out any one line, but I have my opinions on that. I think the strength is in the multiplicity. That's something that came out way back in the battle for Seattle, with that movement against the WTO and IMF and stuff. It was a leaderless movement. It's a lot harder to wipe out a movement that's everywhere, that's locally grounded, that is cooperative. So I think that's a strength for us. I think in terms of weapons, we're not gonna win in terms of weapons. So I tend to really push for nonviolent, but it can be resistance, disobedience, whatever. But I'm not gonna attack anybody who needs to defend themselves with violence. But I think that nonviolent values are part of the solidarity economy that we emulate, and I'm a Gandhi fan in terms of that. The really satyagraha, really militant nonviolence.
Okay. And maybe I'll just throw in that, community defense mechanisms are sometimes context specific. But if you can develop the defense strategies for your specific context, and by defense strategies, I'm thinking very broadly, right? That tenant resistance is a defense strategy, labor strikes are a defense strategy, those are different sort of strategies that people are using to resist efforts to oppress them in their homes, in their workplace, in the political process. If you can think about how those things work locally, then you can kind of federate with other organizations that are thinking about how they function nationally, and eventually, maybe there's a global opportunity there.
Power in numbers and power in coming together on all levels.
Okay.
And I know that there's been some development of solidarity economy security, right? So for events, but also for community defense. I don't know how well developed that is, but I definitely have heard organizations that were trying to actually formally develop those skills at training. and sort of institutionalize those roles. And there is a lot of discussion about how right now, solidarity economy is so marginal that we're not a serious threat. Although, I mean, we'd all like it to be. But face it, if we ever became more of a threat, if we become more prominent, more powerful, there will be pushback, there will be stop down. So there is that. I don't think it's very well thought out, like what our response would be. But that's what history also tells us. This stuff gets stomped on, especially when it involves folks that are people of color or other people who are othered.
Yeah. It's a good question.
Okay, and yeah, I think the sort of final, well, no, there's two more. If the question about whether or not we mentioned Cooperation Jackson, Mondragon, or Evergreen tonight, they, were not mentioned. They are certainly very prominent examples of solidarity economy. On a personal level, I sometimes get a little tired of the Mondragon reference just because I know how context specific that history is, and I don't know if we can really replicate it, but that's just my personal, opinion there. But they are very important examples.
So I would add to that Cooperation Jackson is an important example of that intersection, those intersecting spheres, the resist and the build, right? They're engaging in all of that, right? They're engaging in building a solidarity economy, as well as the political and electoral strategy, as well as the grassroots organizing. So they bring all that together, and the cultural interpersonal change. And they do it all within such a sophisticated sort of analysis and principled stand around Black liberation and self-determination. So, I mean, yes, so they're on our board, they're on the SEN board. Yeah, they're featured a lot in solidarity economy circles. I would say Mondragon is, I get you, Mike. I understand that. And there's lots of critiques that could be made about Mondragon, but it is also a pretty inspiring example. And Evergreen Cooperative did take a cue from Mondragon. So Evergreen in Cleveland, if people know that, they married two things. They married the Mondragon model of trying to create a network of connected worker co-ops with an anchor institution model. So saying, okay, there are these anchor institutions, they're anchored in place, they're not going anywhere, like hospitals and colleges. They spend X amount of dollars, lots of that is going far away. So what can we build locally that could meet those anchor institution needs to build local co-ops that would provide jobs in hard-pressed neighborhoods. So Evergreen brought those things together. Certainly the organization that I'm the co-director of, we built on the Evergreen, both that anchor institution, and we're creating that network like Mondragon. We're now working with 3 other organizations, Cooperation Jackson, Co-op Cincy, and Cooperación Santa Ana. So Mississippi, Ohio, California, Massachusetts, to try to build a national childcare co-op. All of us share this strategy of building a networked, connected a network of co-ops. So this is all taking like a lesson from Mondragon. We're not trying to reproduce Mondragon because yes, there were many things that were very specific to that Basque region of Spain. But this idea of a network, as opposed to lots of co-op developers, they support the creation of a single co-op and then they're on their own. It might be years of mentorship, but they're not trying to keep them connected. Whereas the groups that I just mentioned, for example, are trying to really create that mutually supportive relationship between the co-op businesses as well as the nonprofit. So it is, it feels like there are seeds that we're trying to grow in a way that works in the US.
Okay, and 7:30, I guess this is the last question, and perhaps an opportunity to kind of do any closing that you would like. Is there a plan to make this a series? Because there are many co-ops around the country people could receive reviews about. So, you know, an opening for a series or an SE 101 or any other number of things that people might be trying to teach that I've overheard.
Ah, we can discuss it in the board. I mean, this came out of a group of groups that Sen brought together, but not just Sen. And we wrote our article and seeing the time, and we're trying to put out the word in different ways. So that's one idea, would be to do a series of webinars. I think co-ops are very important. We don't want to just narrow just to co-ops, but that a series on co-ops would be very good. And there is, of course, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. That is a wonderful organization that does nationally organize and has conferences that we could also point you to. But we'll think about it.
Okay, so I'm kicking it back over to Brandon or you all to close us out. That was the end of the question list.
Awesome. Well, thank all of you for, attending this. You guys are really awesome. Is there any type of social media that people can reach out to you through, like through Twitter or whatnot?
I'm really bad at social media, but people can email me. It's just my name @gmail.com.
All right. So it's emilykawano@gmail.com.
That's fine.
Yeah. Well, I do have a Twitter handle that I don't even remember. I think it's just julie.mathai, but I don't really check it, I must say. So my email's on the screen. I think I never changed my name, but you have to spell Wellesley, WELLESLEY, or just Google. Speaking of Google Julie Mathai, and you'll find me. You'll find an email.
Awesome.
I'm very open to email. Sorry, I'm old-fashioned.
No problem. Mike,
Sure.
where can people find you?
Yeah, I am at Colanut Collab, KOLANUT on all social media, Instagram, Twitter, Colanut Collaborative on Facebook. But in the chat, I've also placed the Facebook group for the Solidarity Economy. So, join there, continue posing questions, continue, opening conversation. Yeah, and then on Facebook, look up DSA Solidarity Economy Network and US Solidarity Economy Network. And there's all sorts of content that's, playing there as things evolve.
Yeah, and this has been a really exciting conversation. So hopefully we can work out some ways of continuing this series. I know there'll be other series such as a Solidarity Economy 101, that sort of thing, in different kind of webinars and programming. My name is Brandon Peyton Carrillo. You can reach out to me on Twitter at @BPeytonCarrillo. There's double R's and double L's in the Carrillo. Shameless plug. Just dropped a single today, so you can go on Spotify and all digital resources and type in Brandon Peyton Carrillo and get all that good stuff. But yeah, just look out for more content and happenings through Facebook, like Mike mentioned. And thank you all for attending.
Yeah. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care.